Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hi, Patti. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Great. And Patti, I would like to start with a quick story or a curiosity, because you need to know that many years ago, I wanted to work for Duarte. I've always considered Duarte like the top in the game. And what I did, I have prepared my job application, but instead of sending you a standard CV, what I had done was I prepared a presentation, and it was a presentation about me, my background, and how I thought I would have been a great asset for the team. But then I never sent it. Because at the time I was living in London. I still am, and my now wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, she was living in Italy. And so we were already struggling a little bit with that kind of distant relationship. And I knew that just in case the application went well, I couldn't have moved to the US anyway. So I never sent it. But I just wanted to let you know.
I'm glad you didn't send it, not because you didn't join Duarte, but because you're doing this podcast now.
Yeah. Thank you. And I would like to, so today, Patti, we are going to talk about the ideas that you shared in your recent book, Presenting Virtually. And I would like to start with something which applies to virtual presentations, but any type of presentation. And externally, when I look at the work that you do, you individually, but at Duarte in general, if I were to summarize what you do and how you do it in one word, and I would love to hear your thoughts, the word I would choose is empathy. Mm-hmm. I think that you put a lot of emphasis on the idea of communicating with empathy, which is super important. Could you please explore for our listeners, this idea? What does it mean really to communicate with empathy, either in a presentation or in any other kind of communication context?
Absolutely. It really is fundamentally about taking on the perspective of your audience, or in communication theory, it's called your communication partner, the person that you are interacting with, or the group of people you're interacting with, and using your understanding of them, their needs, their concerns, to design your communication, to craft your communication, rather than coming from a place of, I'll say, ego, which would lead you to say the things you want to say without really considering what others need from you. Empathy and empathetic communication is about starting with them first, which to me is a very strategic decision, because you wouldn't be communicating to another person or group of people if you didn't have some kind of objective you're trying to achieve by doing that, to persuade them, to inspire them, to motivate them, to move them to think or feel in some way by the end. And the more you understand them, the more you will likely be successful in achieving that objective in the end.
Yeah, this is great. And I think it's one of the most powerful concepts in communication, because it has implications then on the way, for example, you go about creating, designing, delivering a presentation. It's their presentation, it's the audience's presentation, not yours as the presenter. And also, talking about in more detail the ideas that you shared in your book, Patti. Now, I don't know about your experience, but what I see is that there are presenters who are great at giving face-to-face, in-person presentations. But then when it comes to trying to recreate the same kind of enjoyable experience for the audience online, it doesn't work just as well. Or vice versa. You've got great online presenters, but they are not able to replicate the experience in a face-to-face context. So if we take the first example, a presenter who is great at giving face-to-face presentations, but not as good online. What do you think? Why does that happen? What are some of the key challenges around online presentations?
Well, One of the qualities, first of all, I'll say I completely agree with you and have observed the same thing in working with executives and individual contributors who are having to pivot to online. The people who just light up a room when they're face to face fall flat many times when they're presenting virtually. And I think one of the reasons that happens is that they feed off the energy of the audience. They're very oftentimes extroverted, though not exclusively. The people who perform well in person or on a big stage setting, they know how to take up that space. They know how to work the room. They just bring lots of energy into the environment. And they don't get that same feedback from the audience when they go online. So they can't tell if their jokes are landing. They can't see the audience many times if an online audience has their cameras off. And so that feedback loop for a very extroverted presenter or one who's accustomed to interacting with the audience is gone. And that's disorienting, it's frustrating. Most of them just really hate presenting online because it's like you're a comedian who's just dying on stage. You have no idea if anything is landing. The people who present really well virtually can be people who are equally good on stage, but they have to be comfortable with interacting with the audience in a different way. They have to work a little harder using different techniques to draw the audience in, polls and questions in the chat and breakout rooms. And it's just a very different kind of facilitation. And it does take facilitation skill, which is not the same as presenting. Presenting is standing and delivering. Facilitating is holding space and inviting people in. And in my opinion, a great virtual presentation has qualities of both.
Yes, and we're going to talk about all of these techniques that you mentioned, Patti. And now, but before we get there, before we talk about the techniques and the principles around delivering an effective virtual presentation, you talked about some of the key challenges that you notice. What are some of the benefits instead? Because I think we need to realize that there are also many benefits that we can take advantage of today that we can communicate online. What do you think are some of the key benefits that we can consider?
One of the biggest benefits of online communication, virtual presentations, is that you can reach a lot more people. It's very convenient for speakers. Many of us who used to fly to present in person love the convenience of being able to give keynotes from home. And for a busy executive, that's really good news. And also just the ability to get your content in front of people who also don't have to fly or travel somewhere to actually hear you. And so the organizations that we work with, some of the world's biggest brands who pivoted their events to virtual the past year and a half, 2 years, found that their audiences increased exponentially. And they were reaching buyers in geographies that they didn't often reach in the past. And they were reaching deeper into organizations, people in lower level roles who didn't always get the budget to go somewhere. So reach is one of the biggest ones.
Yep. And there's also something, Patti, that I saw in your book, and I love. You say that Duarte, and I have it written here, you have a rule, I think you call it the golden rule. It is never deliver a presentation you wouldn't want to see through, which is great. But then you said that you've updated it today and you say, never deliver a virtual presentation that is less engaging than it would have been in person, right? So I know it can be a broad question, but how do we go about delivering an online presentation which is at least as engaging as it would have been in person? What are some of the key things to consider? And then we can explore perhaps each of them in more detail.
For sure. Well, you have to craft your content differently for an online presentation. And backing up, one of the things that is different, one of these greater disadvantages or challenges of the medium is the increased distraction of your audience. So if they're watching your presentation on a device, whether it's their laptop or a mobile device, they're doing it in an environment where they can do other things at the same time. If they're on their laptop, they probably have other applications open and they can check their email. So your email becomes, their email becomes your biggest competitor. If it's on a mobile device, they might have other apps they're flipping between. And so there are other things that are easier for them to pay attention to than you. And if you know that your audience is distracted, then you have to create reasons for them to tune into you, to keep paying attention to you. And that really starts with having something interesting to say, but also delivering it in an interesting way, creating smaller bites of content that are easier for them to consume, injecting variety into your presentation so that it's not the same looking slide over and over. It's not the same key points you're reiterating. It's not the same format of information. You're not using the same tone of voice. You need to inject a lot more variety in all of those ways so that your audience has good reason to pay attention to you, and so you can keep luring them back to you and away from their inbox or apps.
Yeah, a couple of follow-up questions on those, because you mentioned that online, it's even harder today to keep the audience's attention high. And in the book, you talk about this idea of moving away from one-way lectures towards more interactive presentations, which I think, Patti, is always relevant, even in an in-person presentation. But I agree with you, online, it becomes even more useful. And you talk about the idea of creating a presentation which is like a designed conversation. I think that's the term you use, a designed conversation, which is very interesting. For listeners, could you expand on that? Could you tell us more about what a designed conversation looks like?
Sure. Yeah, that is, I think, a much more engaging way to craft a presentation that makes your audience feel involved. As you were saying, the linear presentation, where I just stand and deliver, or I click and deliver, is something that audiences are losing patience with. And we did a survey last year, Duarte did, of communicators and business professionals, several hundred of them, and they all came back and said they prefer presentations that are more interactive. They prefer opportunities to ask questions of the speaker, to have interaction with each other. And that's really what a designed conversation allows. And that, if you think about what a conversation is and how it's different than a presentation, it is two-way. A presentation is often one way. It's, I'm presenting to you and get my messages out. Conversation is a give and take, a back and forth. And so a designed conversation is you as the communicator choosing how you're going to interact with your audience, how to create moments within your narrative where you can draw them in to dialogue with you. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. I've mentioned before polls and chats and even just pausing and taking questions. But you can also create an actual conversation by involving others in your presentation. So this is the classic panel conversation or moderated discussion where you have other people, other voices involved in your presentation, and you create these sort of moments in your presentation where there is more of a give and take. It's more interesting to an audience. I think that's one of the reasons why podcasts are so hot right now, because we just love to listen to people talk and debate ideas. So why not bring some of that to your presentation?
Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways here, Patti, for our listeners today is that you can inject those moments of interaction, and you can do it with purpose, with intention. You can do it in advance as you prepare your presentation, so that when those moments of interaction happen, they look like a spontaneous conversation, which in a way it is, but as the presenter, you've planned in advance, or at least some part of it, which I think is something that not many people consider and can be very powerful, especially for online communication. And also, Patti, I would like to go back to what you said before. You talked about variety, and maybe you've covered everything already, but in case you'd like to explore this in a little bit more detail, you say in the book that when something happens in a presentation, it could be an interruption, for example, then as the presenter, you've lost the audience's attention. And so as the presenter, it's up to you to gain it back. And you say that you can do that by including novelty in a presentation. So it's this idea again of injecting some element of change. I think you talked about it already, but is there anything else? Do you have any other practical examples, things that we can do to create novelty within a presentation?
Well, certainly. The designers at Duarte are pretty good at creating slide templates and designs that have a lot of visual variety to them, yet still a coherent look and feel, consistent look and feel. And so that's a very simple way to inject novelty in a presentation. Just have a variety in slide types. Sometimes it's a big text statement, and sometimes it's a photo, and sometimes it might be a chart. So not always delivering information in the same way makes things more interesting visually for your audience. And also this idea of variety in your voice. That's another way to inject novelty. Novelty basically registers in the brain when something different happens. There's a change in our environment when we see something different, we hear something different. And so vocal variety is a way to inject that sense of change into your presentation by sometimes speaking loudly and sometimes speaking softly, or taking a pause from time to time. So the more predictable any part of your presentation is, the more likely your audience is going to think, aha, I figured out the pattern here. And so I can do something else because now I know how to pay attention to this presentation. So you want to disrupt that by causing a little bit of change with something interesting in your delivery.
Yeah, so true. And you mentioned voice, for example. I think that in general, voice is a very powerful communication tool. Online, probably, it's one of the most, if not the most powerful tool that we have. And also another very interesting concept that I found in your book, Patti, is this idea of communicating in multiple dimensions rather than just one dimension. And I think that it would be very useful for listeners today to learn more about this. How can we create a presentation? How can we communicate in general in multiple dimensions?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, this idea was born from looking at this virtual medium and how it's like other media. And one of the media it's the most like is television, if you think about it, because we're essentially on camera all the time when we're presenting virtually. We're looking into a webcam or the little dot on our laptop, and that functions like a television camera, and it creates a scene for the audience. And when you think about your virtual presentation like a film director thinks about what the audience sees through the camera lens, it influences the way that you curate the scene. And there were multiple dimensions to the scene. Again, thinking about it sort of like a film director, there's the actor, which is you, in this case, the presenter, and the wardrobe, the costume that the actor is wearing. So you and how you appear is one dimension of what the audience sees. The graphics that you use, your slides, or whether you sketch things or you use a digital whiteboard, that's another dimension. The graphics that you use to amplify what you're saying. And the third dimension is the scene itself, the backdrop behind you. Again, thinking of it like a film director, they put as much energy into designing the sets and choosing the environments and composing the scene for the audience to convey information, something about the character, something about the story. And so the backdrop behind us is just as important. And when I talk to people who are presenting virtually, even almost 2 years or 2 years or more into this, most of them say they pay the least attention to their backdrop because I think they're so busy planning what they're going to say and the slides they're going to share that they don't have time to think about the environment that they're in. So all three are equally important, and they can all work together to reinforce your message.
Yeah, and one of the things I found interesting in your book is that I don't know if I'm going to explain it correctly now, but if I understood well, you say that a presenter should think of himself or herself as another design element, if you want. So it's not just the slide, it's also you, it's the backdrop. By the way, talking about the backdrop, now I don't know if this is working today. So I've just moved into a new house, Patti, and I realized a few days ago that, and you talk about these things in the book, that every time I was speaking, I tested the room. It created a lot of echo. And so last minute, I had to buy some acoustic panels, and hopefully they are working. But you also talk about these practical tips in the book. And talking about practical tips, you mentioned, for example, before, eye contact, looking at the camera. Now, I don't want to talk about, it's not, I wouldn't say that it's obvious, because it's not. Most people don't look at the lens of the camera when communicating online. But let's take it for granted. We know that if we want to make good eye contact online, we need to look at the lens of the camera, because that's where the audience is, online. Now, I would love for you to explain to our listeners why we need to do that. Why is it important to make good eye contact? Because some people tell me, sometimes even our clients, yeah, but why? In the end, what happens if I'm not looking at the camera, I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at my slides? What's the point? Why is this really important? What do you think, Patti?
Well, at the most fundamental level, when we make eye contact, it's a way to create connection with our audience, to show them, I'm paying attention to you. Yeah, and if you believe that that doesn't matter, then I think you're falling into that trap of the communications about me. It's about me and my messages and getting those across. But as I said earlier, I believe it's actually about the audience, because otherwise you might as well be reading your slides to yourself. So the looking into the camera lens is the equivalent of making eye contact to a person that you're meeting face to face with. If you were trying to convey to your spouse or significant other that you care about them, would they believe you if you stared at your feet the whole time you were talking? If you looked out the window at other people that were walking by? No, most likely they wouldn't. It's a sign that you are interested in this other person that you're communicating to.
Yeah. And also you mentioned a very practical tip, which I love, that Nancy Duarte follows. You say, and please feel free to then continue, but you say that what she does when she communicates something with her staff, when she has a script, then she puts it into a Word file and she plays it right below the camera. But then, if you remember, Pat, she does something else. I would love for you to share that very practical tip with the listeners, which is connected to eye contact, right?
Yeah, well, she does. She puts it into a Word file, particularly for these video memos that she was recording for our employees during the height of the pandemic. And so she didn't use any slides. It was just her words. And it was very important, though, that she said the words that she had carefully crafted without losing eye contact. She wanted her employees to feel safe, reassured, seen, heard. And so she took that Word file, she moved it on her secondary monitor right below the webcam that she looks into to record her videos, and she narrowed the margins so that she could read her lines without having to dart her eyes to the right or to the left, which you may have seen me do, actually, unfortunately, in this conversation earlier, because I had my self view on, so I turned it off so that I wasn't distracted by myself and I could stay focused on the center of the screen, which is where you are. So she narrowed those margins, and that made it easier for her to quickly skim without breaking eye contact.
Sometimes the smarter solutions are the simple ones. We don't think about it, but it's great. And right, so far, Patti, we talked about eye contact and a few other practical tips. What about gestures, hand movements? We know that the more we move our hands, the more dynamic we can be as presenters. You talked about vocal dynamism before. I love that word. I think dynamism, that's what the audience wants. They want dynamism. We can be dynamic speakers by changing the way we use our voice. We can also be dynamic speakers by changing what we do with our body. For example, hand gestures. And I think this is an interesting one, because when we have a conversation with a friend, then we are not thinking about what we are doing with our hands. But as soon as it becomes more of a formal presentation, these two things start taking a life of their own. We don't know what to do with them. So if somebody asks you in a presentation, what should I do with my hands? What would be your top tips?
Well, I talk in the book about 3 ways that you can use hand gestures. They're signifiers, basically using your hands to signify something. Like if you're telling a story about a person and you want everyone to know they were wearing a tie, you can mime putting on a tie or tightening a tie. But a lot of times how we signify things, or we count out numbers with our hands. I'm going to tell you 3 things. Or we make the shape of something. We do this a lot at Duarte. We make the shape of a heart to express our affection for each other people that we're communicating to. So those are signifiers. And then there are amplifiers. You can use your hands to kind of amplify an idea or to delineate. So that is another very comfortable way, I think, for a lot of people to use hand gestures if they're not as comfortable using them for more theatrical expressions, if you will, just to delineate a space. So this was this big, we were this far apart, or we're this close, just this close to achieving our goal, or we need to make that number go up. Right, so we can use our hands to indicate the space that we're operating in, or the scale of an idea that we're trying to communicate. The trick is that in virtual communication, you have to make sure that those hand gestures are actually visible. So you have to hold your hands a little higher than is naturally comfortable. If you're speaking with your friends in person, they're probably down around your waist, but you need to hold them a little higher if you want the audience to see them in the camera lens, unless you're doing full body video frame.
That's a great practical tip. Thank you very much for sharing those insights, Patti. And in the book, connected to both gestures and the very first thing we mentioned, which is empathy, it's about them. You say that, and I love this idea, that we also need, if, for example, we are giving a presentation to an audience in a region that's a bit unfamiliar to us, then we also need to think about and pay attention to those kind of things. Because, for example, a particular gesture that's appropriate in the US or in the UK may not be perceived the same way in other regions, which is the idea also of creating a presentation which is as also accessible as possible, to make it relevant, to make it about them, to make it accessible, which I think, Patti, you talk about in the book, and it's a super important topic, and it becomes more and more important for the right reasons. Do you have any other ideas or tips, anything at all that you would like to share if somebody wants to learn how to create a presentation which is as accessible as possible?
Yeah, well, one of the fundamentals is making it possible to for people using screen readers to be able to consume the information on your slides. So a screen reader is essentially software or technology that reads aloud the text that is on a screen. That won't work if your text is embedded in graphics. It's not actually independent text. You need to essentially communicate information in a couple different ways. You can have a graphic, but then you need to have a text descriptor of that graphic, so that the screen reader can actually identify what is being said. And closed captions, for sure, are also a good thing to make available to your audience so that they can follow along. And it's kind for non-native speakers as well, because I turn on closed caption when I'm watching a lot of television shows that are from outside the US, because I have trouble following the accent. And it's very nice to me. It's very helpful to me. And it's kind to your audiences as well to make that available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so far, Patti, we talked about eye contact, hand movement, gestures, lots of delivery techniques. I'm thinking about another thing to consider from a delivery perspective, which is posture. And what would you say there, particularly when it comes to virtual presentations? Sitting versus standing, or in the book you talk about the rule of thirds. I don't want to give you the answers, of course, but I remember that there was a useful, practical piece of advice. Anything at all you would like to share in terms of posture in an online presentation?
Yeah, well, sitting versus standing is a very polarizing topic. Some people have very strong opinions one way or the other. And what I would say is, You want to be comfortable as a presenter, but not too comfortable, because the more comfortable you are, the more you're going to slouch, the more that you're going to start to swallow your voice. It's going to disappear inside of you, and it's not going to project as clearly to your audience. And even if I'm using wired earbuds here, the quieter my voice gets, the lower that signal is, the less easy it is for your equipment to pick it up. And so I want to start with a stronger signal to begin with, meaning a stronger voice. So the more upright I sit, the more I can breathe freely, the more that my breath can amplify my voice, which just makes it a little louder, a little clearer. And for those of us who have a tendency to slouch, it's better to stand while we're presenting so that we don't fall into that temptation of relaxing so much that now our voices get tiny. But at minimum, you want to sit up or stand more upright so that that voice can really come out unobstructed.
Yeah, and now that you say this, talking about posture and maybe potentially also setup, in the book you give another very practical tip. I don't know whether, if I remember well, whether that's something that you do or something that you do with your clients, maybe that what you could do is, depending on the setup that you create, you could have maybe something on the floor. It could be your home position, I think you call it. Yeah. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that single practical tip?
For sure. When you're presenting by standing, this becomes more important to essentially mark your position on the floor so that you don't move too far out of the camera's view. And we do this a lot, and with our clients as well, for those more formal presentations, particularly ones that are being recorded on video, where continuity matters. For instance, if you're recording a portion and then you make a mistake and you have to stop and pick up recording again, you want to make sure that you're in that same position when you start recording again. Yeah. And if you are also using what we would call, for instance, overlay graphics, or if your text or images are being edited into that video after the fact, many times that means you have to stand off to the side so that there's room for your graphics to appear next to you in the video frame. But sometimes it might cut to you in a full body, full screen takeover of you speaking. And so you want to make sure that for those times when you move away for the graphics to take the full screen and then move back in, that you're coming into a consistent position. So putting tape on the floor to mark where your feet should be when you're fully in the frame, and also to mark where your feet should be when you're supposed to be out of the frame, are good things to do. Okay. And if you ever work with a professional video crew, they'll often do that for you.
I'll tell you, yeah. And because you talked about graphics, slides, although we haven't talked about it really today, but again, I know that at Duarte, because I read about it in the various books that you and Nancy wrote, there is a test that you recommend, the glance test, which I think, of course, we can learn a lot about presentation design, following some key fundamental principles of design, applying them to the design of a presentation. But I think this single test is great and super useful. If everybody in the world followed the glance test or considered the glance test, I think we wouldn't have the typical death by PowerPoint that we see all the time. So again, for our listeners, for those who are not aware of these principle, what's the glance test?
Well, the glance test is essentially a way to check whether your slide is understandable to your audience in a small amount of time. And it comes from the idea that slides are glance media, like billboards. If you're driving down a road and there's a billboard off to the side that has a message on it, it needs to be readable by you in a couple of seconds. Otherwise, you might crash into the car in front of you. You have to be able to glance to the right, figure out what that billboard's about, and keep moving. And slides are similar to that. They should not have more text than a billboard or than a simple phrase, because then it starts to be too much for your audience to read and also listen to you at the same time. So the presumption is, I'm speaking and my slide is supporting me. It's reinforcing what I'm saying. So I don't want it to compete with me and say more than I'm saying or different things than what I'm saying. And the way to solve that is to pare your slide down to the minimum information that your audience could read in a single glance. And you can test this out yourself by looking at your slide for just a couple of seconds and then glance away and see if you can remember what it was about. And if you can't, then it's probably too complicated. If
billboards were designed the way most people design slides, I think partly there would be many car accidents in the world, right?
It'd be a more dangerous world, for sure.
More dangerous world. And also, look, again, from a delivery perspective, we talked about a lot of practical techniques: eye contact, body language, posture, gestures, hand movements. I don't know what you think. Please feel free to let me know if you don't agree, which is totally fine. But I think that in the end, it is really hard, if not impossible, to master and to improve on any of these techniques if we don't prepare well for a present, if we don't rehearse. I think rehearsing is super important. And I think that it's also important to rehearse, I would say, in the real world, like in an environment. It could be physical, if possible, at least mental environment, which is as close as possible to the actual environment that you will have in the real presentation. What are your thoughts around this, Patti?
There is no substitute for preparation. I completely agree. You spend so much time, you meaning our listeners who are developing presentations, so much time planning what you're going to say, and then developing graphics to support what you want to say, and then often so little time rehearsing how you're going to say those things, or how you're going to refer to your slides as they're projected next to you, behind you, however you're sharing them. And it doesn't make sense. It's the preparation that you do is the final mile, but it's the most important mile. If you don't know how you're going to deliver those slides, you basically are going to fall down in front of the audience, and everything that you so carefully crafted is going to be for naught if you forget your key points, or if you step on your slides because you're speaking to them too soon or too late. So that preparation, that rehearsing with your visual aids is really important, but also, as you said, with the tools in the environment that you're going to present in. That's one of the keys to getting comfortable, particularly for people who are nervous, who have stage fright or virtual stage fright. Rehearsing is the best way to get over it.
Yeah. And talking about tools, I think, if I remember well, you take as far as sometimes for a formal presentation, I think you wrote in the book, sometimes you wear your high heels, for example, because you want to recreate that kind of real world scenario, right?
Yeah, very much. I think it helps for it to be as real as possible, so that you will put the same amount of energy into your rehearsal as you would into the real thing. And when I'm on stage, I wear heels. So for really big keynotes, I'll wear them at home too.
Nice, I love it. And Patti, are there any presenters that you admire? And it could be, today mainly we are talking about virtual presentations. So it could be somebody who's great at delivering online presentations, or in general, like presentations in general. Any particular presenter that you really admire?
Well, they're probably not people that you know. They're people that I work with. They're leaders who are very empathetic, who are also very comfortable when they're presenting. I admire people who are fully themselves when they present. And so it's not always about being the big, bombastic, charismatic personality. It's about being the best version of yourself. And I've worked with some leaders who are very wise, but not necessarily loud, and yet they can really hold an audience in thrall because they're genuine and because they tell a story that's heartfelt, and that's what moves me. It's I have TED Talks that I enjoy watching. Some of my favorites, Sir Ken Robinson, which I would say is not necessarily a traditional presenter, but that classic raconteur who could tell a great story and have the audience laughing. I admire that because that's not me.
Yeah,
but I also really admire people who are fully themselves and connect well with an audience, no matter what their personality is.
Yeah, and I think, Patti, that's also connected to what you said before. Before you talked about dynamism, becoming a dynamic presenter, and now you said the audience doesn't necessarily want energy from a presenter. Maybe sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not, but what they do want all the time is dynamism. So it's not necessarily about being energetic, but definitely you want to create and inject those moments of change, variety, and you can do that, as we said, with voice, body, but you definitely want to be dynamic. And instead, is there, and this is just for me really, because I love reading and books. Now, I know it could be a tough question. I don't know, you tell me, but I'm sure that there are many, many books. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a book. It could be an article, a podcast, an interview. If it's a book, even better. One book in particular, if you think about public speaking, presentation skills, communication, that you would recommend, if possible, beyond your own resources. But before you think about it, as you think about it, then let me mention this to our audience. I highly recommend everything you've done. So presenting virtually now, super recommended. Also, you co-authored Illuminate with Nancy some years ago. And also everything that Nancy Duarte wrote, Slideology, Resonate. Also recently, a couple of years ago, maybe or last year, Data Story. So all of them are fantastic resources if somebody wants to improve their presentation skills. Highly recommended, all of them. Again, including Presenting Virtually Now. Anything else? Maybe one book that was really meaningful for you from a public speaking perspective?
Well, now that you've taken all my tools away, because I would definitely recommend any book Nancy Duarte wrote, and I would have said Resonate. So this isn't a book about presenting, but I think it is in the spirit very much of what I've been saying is important for presenters, which is to empathize and connect with other people. And the book that I'm thinking of is Dare to Lead by Brené Brown, or anything that she's ever written, which is, as she would say it, about wholehearted leadership, wholehearted living. She's a new one, the Atlas of the Heart, I think it's called, that I'm just starting to read. And what I love about Brené Brown's writing in all of her books is that she gives people permission to be their real selves, to live fully integrated lives, meaning you are your real self at work and your real self at home. And I would add, and you're your real self on the stage, in person or virtually. The more that you can express who you really are to an audience, I believe the more they're going to feel connected to you.
Yeah.
The more they're going to feel inspired by you, the more they're going to be impressed by you. That's just fundamental of effective communication and relationship, which is to be your real self.
Yeah, it is a fundamental message. Thanks for sharing that, because sometimes people are looking for tips and tricks and techniques to give the perfect presentation, but there's no such thing as the perfect presentation or the perfect presenter. But as you said before, you definitely want to be the best authentic version of yourself. And I love everything that Brené Brown does. By the way, her TED Talk on the power of vulnerability is also a fantastic conversation, going back to what we said before. And great. And Patti, we are approaching the conclusion of our conversation. If anybody wants to connect with you, what should they do? Where do they find you?
Well, you can go to duarte.com and you can find information about the things that I do. But to connect to me personally, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I accept pretty much every invitation that people send me there. And I have a Twitter account, I have an Instagram account, but I tend to publish more frequently on LinkedIn, and it's a more reliable way to get in touch with me.
Okay, perfect. And and again, that's a question I like to ask our listeners. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But so we talked about many things today. What's the one thing, the most important thing, if somebody wants to improve their ability to pitch, present, communicate their ideas online, maybe, but also in general, it doesn't have to be an online presentation. What's the one, if there was one thing you would love for our listeners to take away today, what would that be?
Practice. I don't think there's any better way to get better at anything than to try it and try it again and again and again. So we talked about the importance of preparation and rehearsing. Do it. Get yourself more repetitions, those extra hours that anybody needs to master anything.
Yeah, perfect. And anything else, Patti? Now that we close our conversation, are there any final messages that you would like to share with our listeners? Any asks, any requests for our audience? Anything at all that you would like to share today?
Well, my closing message is that this is a really powerful medium. Being able to connect with audiences online helps you reach more people. And I think there's not a better time to learn how to do that, to really master the use of this platform so that more people can hear your ideas, more people can be inspired by those ideas. You're inches away when you figure out how to master this medium from essentially being a broadcaster. So why not? Make your own content, put it out there in the world, and give people that inspiration and the education that only you can provide.
But I think that's the perfect way to end this conversation. And by the way, you talked about broadcasters, TV before. I really very much enjoyed your analogies around, like, from TV and today online communication in the book. So again, Presenting Virtually by Patti Sanchez, highly recommended. Patti, thank you so much for, exactly, there it is. Feel free to hold it. Yeah, people need to know about it. Great. And thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated it, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, your insights. I know for sure that this has been a very useful and practical conversation for our listeners. So again, thank you very much. Keep up the excellent work that you do individually at Duarte as well. And let's keep in touch. All the best.
Thank you to you as well.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.